Hey everybody, this is a piece titled Comparing the Hamas Pogrom of the 7th of October to the Holocaust is a misuse of Holocaust remembrance, say Omer Bartov, Raz Segal, Christopher Browning et al. This is why they are wrong. By Ingo, Elbe, and Enrico Pfau. A little summary of the piece. Ingo, Elbe, and Enrico Pfau of Karl von Ossietzky University of Oldenburg map the several ways in which those historians who signed an open letter opposing any reference to the Holocaust in discussions of the 7th of October Hamas pogrom, on the ground that such references were an abuse of Holocaust remembrance, are badly wrong. Holocaust without anti-Semitism. Renowned historians have written an open letter. The reason: the use of Holocaust and Nazi references in connection with the Hamas massacre on the 7th of October. The authors consider these references to be abusive and dangerous, not only in certain individual cases, but in general. But are they right? The open letter begins with a few examples. References made to Joe Biden's assessment that the barbarism of Hamas is just as consequential as the Holocaust. It mentions that the statement Netanyahu made to Olaf Scholz, quote, "Hamas are the new Nazis," end quote. And finally, the authors quote Republican politician Brian Mast, rejecting the talk of innocent Palestinian refugees and pointing out that in the Second World War there was no mention of innocent Nazi civilians either. The authors do not discuss any of these statements in detail. They apparently consider themselves exempt from this duty because, in their view, any reference to the Nazis in the case of Hamas is out of the question. Why? The reader does not learn much about this. In fact, it is a single sentence that is supposed to carry the burden of proof. Quote, "The Nazi genocide involved a state and its willing civil society attacking a tiny minority which then escalated to a continent-wide genocide," end quote. These criteria do not apply to Hamas and its actions, but are they even sensible criteria at all? At first, it is remarkable what the authors do not mention: the anti-Semitic mania. They simply ignore the significance of the annihilationist ideology of anti-Semitism for the Nazi perpetrators and their willing civil society. However, if one takes this into account and research on the perpetrators leaves no doubt that one should, the question immediately arises as to whether the authors have set the right priorities in their choice of criteria. For the anti-Semitic mania, it is not decisive whether a state is involved and who is the majority or minority, respectively. Let's assume for a moment that these criteria are pertinent. Are the Jews in the Middle East not a minority? Regarding the terrorist attacks of the 7th of October, the connection between Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah should not be neglected. In the case of Iran, there was and still is a state involved in the current threat to Israel. Here we are dealing with state and parastate anti-Semitism. Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Aqsa brigades, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Lion's Den, Jenin Battalion, and the like would certainly be in a position to expel or even destroy the Jews of Israel if it had not taken massive defensive measures. Once Iran has succeeded in developing a nuclear bomb, it will undoubtedly be able to do so. Indeed, this genocide would not extend over an entire continent, but simply because there are hardly any Jews left in the region outside of Israel. Since the 1940s, hundreds of thousands of them have been expelled from Islamic states or have voluntarily emigrated to the only state that offers them security and freedom. Israel as perpetrator. The above-mentioned definition of the Holocaust serves yet another purpose. The authors of the open letter thereby not only criticize historical reference, but implicitly also accuse Israel. They suggest that there cannot be another Holocaust because Israel, unlike the Jews at that time, can defend itself and can no longer be considered an innocent victim. On the one hand, the authors say that those who do not have a state cannot commit such a genocide. And who has no state? The Palestinians. On the other hand, statements made by two leading Israeli politicians about an alleged battle, quote, between the children of light and the children of darkness, end quote, and against, quote, human animals, end quote, which were made under the immediate impression of the 7th of October, are presented as implying genocidal intentions. These statements, they say, quote, bring to mind echoes of historical mass violence, end quote. One of the signatories, Raz Segal, even openly calls Israeli warfare, quote, a textbook case of genocide, end quote. Holocaust researchers Jeffrey Herf and Norman Goda commented, quote, unlike Hamas's long-standing dogma, such comments reflect the sense of shock and anger Israelis felt only days after the worst massacre in their young nation's turbulent history. More importantly, words like, quote, animals, dehumanizing though they may be, do not reflect Israeli government policy towards civilians, end quote. It is particularly striking how little the authors of the open letter have to say about anti-Semitism, and which should be the main point of any Holocaust analysis. The anti-Semitism of Hamas is only vaguely alluded to or appears as a numinous threat without naming its actors. At one point they say, quote, at one point they even say, quote, anti-Semitism often increases at times of heightened crisis in Israel-Palestine, as do Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism, end quote. As if anti-Semitism were the consequence of this crisis. The crisis. Which, as we will see, was allegedly triggered exclusively by Israel and not primarily its cause. Nowhere in the open letter do we learn what anti-Semitism is. All we get is the explanation that we need, quote, clarity about anti-Semitism so that we can properly identify and combat it, end quote. What many of the signatories think about anti-Semitism, e.g. Moses Segal, Schuler, Springorum, Bartov, Rothberg, Confino, Goldberg, can only be indirectly extrapolated from their signature under the scientifically highly questionable pamphlet of the quote, Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, end quote, which even allows for the demonization of Israel to be labeled, quote, not anti-Semitic per se, end quote, with reference to the presumed intentions and experiences of Palestinians, among other things. Entanglement of National Socialism and Hamas ideology. Let us move on to the issue the authors thought they could avoid with their Holocaust definition. Indeed, the Hamas henchmen are not typical Nazis, and the Hamas pogrom was not the Holocaust. Of course, one can also discuss the theoretical differences between Islamic and Nazi anti-Semitism. The institution of dimitude in traditional Islam usually allowed Jews to survive and practice their faith as long as they agreed to the Islamic claim to supremacy in a state of humble submission, and as long as they accepted their status of second-class human beings at the mercy of an Islamic dominant society, which also included a special tax. Inconceivable under Nazi rule, of course. However, with its founding charter, I should probably read the charter for the channel, actually. Hamas explicitly placed itself in the tradition of elementary redemptive anti-Semitism. In doing so, it reactivated the apocalyptic hadith of Abu Huraira, Abuhurayra, which prophesizes that the last day will come only when the Muslims kill the Jews. It also combines this, in traditional Islam, rather marginalized idea with the, quote, protocols of the elders of Zion, end quote, one of the most prominent documents of modern European anti-Semitism, in which the Jews are portrayed as world conspirators behind wars, crises, and modern media, and which was an important point of reference for the National Socialists. Since the Jews dared to found a state on, in the eyes of the Islamists, Islamic soil, and fought for equal rights, the difference in the intention of extermination is only a theoretical one anyway, because for Hamas and the like, it justifies the mass murder of Israel's Jews. A Hamas preacher, Yunis al-Astal, puts it, quote, "We must massacre, bracket, the Jews, end bracket, ... to prevent them from sowing corruption in the world. We must restore them to the state of humiliation imposed upon them. They must pay the jizya, security tax, Jizya, while they live in our midst, ... However, in Palestine, where they are occupiers and invaders, they cannot have the status of dhimmis," end quote. In a letter which vehemently denies any connection between Hamas and Nazi anti-Semitism, all of this must not only be carefully concealed, but the connection between important leaders in the Palestinian national movement of the 1930s and 1940s, such as Mohammed Amin al-Husseini, and National Socialism must also remain anathema. One should not only mention al-Husseini's collaboration with the Nazis in the Holocaust, not only his open declaration that he and Germany were now jointly trying to, quote, eliminate the Jewish question from the world, end quote, not only the Muslim SS units he inspected during the Second World War, or his anti-Jewish propaganda for the Islamic world, but also the closing of the gates of Palestine to Jews fleeing the Nazis, as a direct result of the Mufti's terror in the Palestinian Mandate in the 1930s and the British appeasement policy. Furthermore, the Holocaust researchers' open letter does not tell us anything about the fascist references of the Muslim Brotherhood, from which Hamas derived, and its accompanying Ummah socialist third way ideology of the Islamic people's community against interest, materialism, and secularism. The socio-psychological mechanisms of the skewed healing of collective narcissistic grievances through anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are very similar in Hitler and Sayyid Qutb, an important intellectual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Jews are suspected of being behind all materialist, feminist, and individualist influences that are supposed to destroy any, quote, organic, end quote, community. Quote, behind the doctrine of atheistic materialism was a Jew. Behind the doctrine of animalistic sexuality was a Jew. and behind the destruction of the family and the disruption of sacred relationships in society, ... was a Jew, end quote. The swastikas on the fire kites of the 2018 Hamas, quote, border fence protests, end quote, were no more an anti-fascist protest than the hate sermons of Muslim brother Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who, for years, had been reaching tens of millions of people via the Qatari channel Al Jazeera. In 2009, fantasized Muslims as the accomplishers of the Nazi Holocaust. Quote, throughout history, Allah has imposed upon, bracket, the Jews, end bracket, people who would punish them for their corruption. The last punishment was carried out by Hitler. By means of all the things he did to them, even though they exaggerated this issue, he managed to put them in their place. This was divine punishment for them. Allah willing, the next time will be at the hands of the believers, end quote. Volksgemeinschaft against Israel. The authors of the open letter deliberately ignore the fact that the leadership of the supposedly moderate PLO also propagates anti-Semitism and hatred of Israel, not only through their penchants for terrorists and in public statements, but also in school textbooks and youth camps. It should be noted, however, that the Palestinians have been mobilizing against Israel for decades, aiming at the destruction of the Jewish state, which is to say, not aiming at a state next to Israel, but instead of Israel. Adi Schwartz and Einat Wilf, I'll spell these two names. I'm familiar with them, but I've heard these people speak, but I don't remember how to pronounce their names. Adi Schwartz and Einat Wilf, A-D-I Schwartz, and E-I-N-A-T-W-I-L-F, rightly emphasize that the Palestinian national movement is not a nationalism that primarily wants a state for its own people, but one that wants to prevent or destroy the state of another, namely the Jewish people, as the PLO's reaction to Israel's most far-reaching peace offers in the history of the conflict in 2000 and 2008 have shown. The Hamas attack on the 7th of October is just as much an expression of this sentiment as the overwhelming support that Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank show for one or another variant of eliminationist groups and their terror against Jews and Israeli civilians. In 2014, 93% of respondents in the Palestinian territories agreed with openly anti-Semitic statements, and according to a survey conducted in November 2023, 83.1% of West Bank residents and 63.6% of Gaza residents supported the Hamas massacre of the 7th of October. Damn, that's kind of interesting that it's more supported in the West Bank than in Gaza. "77.7% in the West Bank and 70.4% in Gaza are in favor of a purely Palestinian one-state solution, i.e. one that excludes a state for two peoples and the two-state solution." Historian Benny Morris is right when he calls this attitude, which did not only just emerge over the past several weeks, a, quote, expulsionist mindset, end quote. According to a survey conducted in June 2023, 66% in the West Bank and 79% in Gaza are in favor of the formation of terrorist groups such as Lion's Den or Jenin Battalion. Jeffrey Herf, I have a piece by him on the channel. I think he was actually also the advisor of, what the fuck is that girl's name? I think it's Marlena Gallner, who edited the book of Jean Amory, the leftist critic, the leftist existentialist novelist who, I think he was a novelist. I don't know, the leftist existentialist who critiqued, an Auschwitz survivor, who critiqued the anti-Zionism of the New Left. But yeah, I don't know who, and so, yeah, sorry, I don't know why I'm telling you that, but it might be interesting for some people to know the connections between some of these people. Okay, Jeffrey Herf and Norman Goda therefore rightly ask whether this is not in fact a case of the classical phenomenon of a Volksgemeinschaft based on the anti-Semitic construction of a Jewish enemy, which then would fulfill the supposed criterion of the, quote, willing civil society, end quote, cited by the authors of the open letter. The genocide rumor. This certainly does not justify the, quote, collective punishment, end quote, that the authors of the open letter claim to observe in the attack on the Gaza Strip. But that kind of punishment does not take place at all. Israel is waging a war in which it warns the civilian population of hostilities, allows for escape routes to southern Gaza, and does not deliberately target civilians. Both blockades and attacks on civil infrastructure, misused for military purposes, are not per se illegal under international law. Only recently, one of Germany's leading international law experts stated that the Israeli army was, quote, well aware of its obligations under international humanitarian law, end quote. Quote, before the airstrikes began, end quote, says Professor Matthias Herdigen, quote, there were warnings to residents of danger zones, for example, through messages in mobile networks or through so-called, quote, roof knocking, end quote, ... In the run-up to the ground war, there had been calls for evacuation for weeks, which more and more civilians are now following, although Hamas initially wanted to hold them back. So we see a clear endeavor on the Israeli side to spare the civilian population in accordance with international law. On the Hamas side, it is exactly the opposite, end quote. However, the authors of the open letter do not mention the fact that Hamas has been turning the Gaza Strip into a fortress for years, spending money that could have been invested in civilian infrastructure, and that Hamas is using civilians, whether they support the organization or not, as human shields in violation of international law. The fact that Hamas is not interested in protecting its civilian population has been stated several times by leading representatives. Sorry. None of this is mentioned in the open letter. Nothing either about the fact that the Israeli civilian population has had to live under a hail of rockets since the 7th of October, and that parts of Israel, especially in the north, have been evacuated. The authors describe the anti-Semitic mass murder by Hamas as a, quote, attack, and an anonymous, quote, crisis, in which the qualitative difference between the anti-Semitic pogrom and Israel's warfare is leveled out by the nonchalant listing of, quote, 7th of October attacks and the ongoing aerial bombardment and invasion of Gaza, end quote. Israel as perpetrator. The historians now want to investigate the, quote, causes of the violence in Israel-Palestine, end quote, although their, quote, contextualization, end quote, is a prime example of one-sidedness. They omit or obfuscate crucial connections and instead accuse Israel, and only Israel, of being responsible for the violence of Hamas. This reversal of victim and perpetrator roles, which stems from a simplistic and Manichaean view of the Arab-Israeli conflict, is a widespread phenomenon among anti-Zionist agitators, particularly in the post-colonial milieu. But it is troubling to hear it even from some serious historians such as Omer Bartov or Christopher Browning. The causes of conflict they put forward are quite clear. Quote, 75 years of displacement, 56 years of occupation, and 16 years of the Gaza blockade have generated an ever-deteriorating spiral of violence that can only be arrested by a political solution, end quote. They deliberately conceal the fact that the Palestinian refugee problem is the result of the lost Arab war of aggression and annihilation against the Yishuv and Israel, and that there could have been a Palestinian state and peaceful relations between Palestinians and Israelis long ago if the Arab side had accepted the resolution in favor of a two-state solution from 1937 and 1947, or the Israeli peace offers of 1967, 2000, or 2008. Nor does it occur to them that the massacre on the 7th of October would have taken place long before the year 2023 if Israel had not meticulously controlled and regulated traffic to the Gaza Strip. Here, too, they show that they do not take even outright eliminatory anti-Semitism seriously, as long as it is expressed by Palestinians. A, quote, paternalistic, even neocolonial attitude that refuses to take Palestinians at their word, end quote, as Adi Schwartz and Einat Wilf describe this, quote, West-splaining, end quote, disguised as analysis. Describe this West-splaining as analysis. West-splaining being like, oh, when an ex-person says anti-Semitic thing about Israel, what they really mean is they're opposed to what Israel does. They're not anti-Semitic. That's what they mean by West-splaining. The authors of the open letters state, quote, insisting that, quote, Hamas are the new Nazis, end quote, while holding Palestinians collectively responsible for Hamas's actions, attributes hardened anti-Semitic motivations to those who defend Palestinian rights, end quote. One would like to see evidence that there is even a remotely relevant Palestinian or pro-Palestinian political movement that does not negate the existence of Israel and does not want to destroy the Jewish state. Moderate Palestinian forces were silenced or even executed by the fanatics of the Mufti of Jerusalem in the so-called Arab Revolt between 1936 and 1939. This is an enormous historical burden for Palestinian society, which has additionally been ideologically indoctrinated with the revanchist narrative of the alleged right of return of the 1948 refugees with the support of UNRWA since at least the 1960s. With the exception of isolated dissidents such as Bassem Eid, Mossab Hassan Youssef, or Ahmad Mansour, who have no influence in the community, the vast majority of publicly perceptible Palestinian voices fails to recognize the Jewish state and to condemn the terror of Hamas without ifs and buts. They often do not even support the slogan, quote, "Free Gaza from Hamas," end quote, or they even glorify the terror of the Islamists, as is the case with the self-proclaimed, quote, "progressive grassroots movement," end quote, quote, "Palestine speaks," end quote. Entanglements are welcome, but not when it comes to anti-Semitism. Co-signatories of the open letter, such as Dirk Moses and Michael Rothberg, have been working for years to relativize the Holocaust by placing it in the, quote, biopolitical continuum, end quote, of state refugee policy, colonial rule, and mass crimes. In doing so, the memory of the Shoah is to, quote, be multi-directionally entangled, end quote, with all possible memories of mass crimes. In the end, it is striking that particularly those scholars want to separate the greatest anti-Semitic mass murder since the Holocaust, perpetrated by an organization that places itself in the tradition of eliminatory hatred against Jews, from any connection with the Holocaust and National Socialism. Thanks for listening.